With no further delay, I would like to pass the floor to Professor Harald Tuckerman from St. Gallen. Harald, the floor is yours, and thanks again for helping.
Well, thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure. And I really would have loved to come, but I have a whole workshop tomorrow in Basel, so I wouldn't have made it back on time, also knowing how late dinners are in Portugal. There's a lot of good food and great company. It's a great honor for me to share my research with you, which I will do now. Hope that works. And is that visible? Can everybody see that? And I need to give you a warning because this comes straight out of the workshop. So I'm very, very glad to share that with you on the one hand, but please bear with me that maybe at some point or other throughout my line of thinking, it's a cow on thin ice, as we say in Switzerland. And what I've been looking at is I've been involved with 2 hospitals coping with a COVID-19 pandemic since March 2020. And I'm taking a paradox lens on the way they try to navigate the pandemic. And at the moment, I'm also trying to build a theoretical story which is informative for the paradox lens. And at this point in time, I'm looking at how a both-and approach, which usually is set to enable virtuous cycles, can also risk a vicious cycle. So that's sort of the topic of the whole presentation. Let me see. So, first of all, I'm going to give you an overview of my research approach and the analytic journey so far. Then sort of what I learned from COVID pandemic as a type of crisis, which is different from what we usually know, introduce a paradox perspective, and then I'm going to look at the empirical data of coping with the pandemic and the paradoxical tensions, how the hospital navigated that. I call this the calibration mode, which was a certain type of organizing in order to calibrate between normal and pandemic activities. And then I'm going to try to make sense of the effects of that calibration. And then I'm going to finish off with some ideas about how to move on with paradox research. So let's get started. What I'm interested in is, I'm a professor for, it's called managing pluralistic organizations. That hospitals are sort of the prime example, besides universities, or these kind of organizations that are very, very pluralistic. That means that their value creation is very knowledge intensive. They have a large number of diverse experts who claim a lot of autonomy. So hierarchy in its way of introducing or decision making is limited. And this is why I'm sort of interested in how do hospitals make decisions collectively? How do they move forward? So how do they manage and organize themselves? And in this particular case, how do they cope with COVID-19? I had a field access, which was a stroke of luck, in the sense that on the left-hand side, this blue curve you see are the hospitalizations in Switzerland. So the first wave there, this little peak on the left, is started at the end of February 2020, and I got a sort of call, or I called up the hospital and they gave me within 12 hours very open access to accompany them, and also the other hospital. And I've been with them since until the end of 2021, basically. On the right-hand side, you see these 2 slides, which are the hospitalizations in that hospital I'm going to talk about. And you see once the blue or the green are the hospitalizations on the wards, and the red and the dark violet are the admittances to the ICUs. My method or my research approach is longitudinal. That means that I try to accompany organizations over a longer period of time, in this case, almost 2 years. I do the normal qualitative jump of collecting data through documents internally, externally. I was allowed to observe all task force meetings of the entire hospital and also the daily or weekly meetings of the Clinic for Infectiology, because it was very central to define the measures. Then I made 2 interview series, once in summer 2020, it was after the first wave, and the second one after the second wave in summer 2021 with once 26 and once 17 members of the task force and hospital leadership for 60 to 90 minutes. And besides, what I also did to capture longitudinal data is I interviewed a medical doctor and a nursing director first daily from March to April. Then we thought it was too much COVID. Then we reduced it to once a week, and I'm still interviewing the 2 of them to gain sort of personal insights and longitudinal data. The analysis follows sort of classical process longitudinal process studies from Anne Langley. I first made a case history, then I do temporal bracketing. I try to identify patterns, and now I'm sort of more in the theorizing. And besides that, I plausibilized my findings with both the hospital executive board and the task force. And on Monday, I'm going to be in the Clinic for Infectiology for a workshop with them. So that's sort of the setup. And why does it make sense to take a paradox lens? First of all, I think a paradox lens helps because it highlights a sort of dynamic, incoherent dimension of organizing. So things are not very linear, things are not very straightforward, especially in these settings of these organizations and when it comes to COVID. And if you look at paradox, it's sort of defined as at least 2 contradictory interdependent elements that persist over time, and Linda Putnam adds to that definition, and that impose and reflect on each other. And the paradox lens sort of holds that we have basically, there are several ways of approaching, but there's sort of 2 groups. One is so-called defensive approaches, or either or. It's like taking sides of one element, either doing change or doing stability, either doing centralization or decentralization, or ignoring the paradox altogether. And the literature holds that that is not a very good long-term sustainable approach, because if by definition there are 2 elements which are contradictory but interdependent, then choosing one side will increase the pull toward the other side. So that increases tensions and conflicts, or what Wendy talks about as turf wars or getting stuck, which I kind of like as a metaphor. Also, sort of taking either side, sort of, we know that from the paradox of success, increases the logic of simplicity, so that we get much more and more tunnel vision and are not open anymore, and that might lead to future failure. Overall, as Tsugas and Cunha point out in their handbook chapter, such defensive approaches can trigger vicious cycles. Therefore, paradox lens in general promotes both and approaches, which are active approaches of embracing the tensions, of transcending them. That means that we try to attend to both elements at the same time or in an oscillating manner because they persist. And that helps us to avoid getting stuck or engage in turf wars. And it enables and calls us to come up with creative new solutions. That's sort of what Ford and Beck would say. So in this sense, both end approaches can trigger virtuous cycles. And it means sort of balancing between the poles to move forward and thereby establish a dynamic equilibrium. So many studies have looked at how to establish a both-and approach and what it looks like. And I just named a few examples, and since Camille is here, I very much like your paper on the veterinaries. But of course, there's a but. As the the literature says sort of both and enables. It doesn't guarantee virtuous cycles, and it has limits. What we see increasingly sort of is some sort of boundary conditions or limitations to both end approaches. One is Abdallah and Langley showed how sort of both end approaches can also lead to their own demise. They illustrated that with several cases. It might not be sustainable. That's a limitation Lucia and Lewis point out in their study. It might confuse organizational members. That's what Wendy pointed out in her study on the decision makers and who did a sort of consistently inconsistent decision making. Bertie and Simpson point out it depends, that the both end approach also depends on the power positions of who has more scope to enact solutions. Then Geim and Miguel and colleagues looking at the Volkswagen scandal say, look, I mean, if the both end approach is only rhetorical and not substantial, it's not going to work, as we saw with Volkswagen. And sort of a while ago, Bond and Chiki also showed that unexpected events can sort of jeopardize the both end approach. So what I think, if I look at that, is when we look at sort of, having a paradox and we take a both end approach to navigate it, what we tend to overlook is what kind of effects does that both end approach have on the organization, especially onto the conditions that render paradoxes salient, like resource scarcity. So does it enhance that? Does it deprive the organization of resources, or does it generate new resources? I think that's an important condition, probably, if we ask how to make both end approaches more sustainable. So my goal is to better understand when or why both end approaches enable virtuous cycles and when they don't. And the question, therefore, is when or why does a both end approach risk vicious cycles? And the starting point I'm taking here is coming back to Linda's addition to the definition that these elements impose and reflect back on each other. Actually, I got into reading about circular causality and feedback loops. And this is a very important sort of starting point to start to look at these effects. Now, how did I get there? This is, of course, a longer journey. You don't start out when you start in March 2020. Since I'm doing exploratory research, I come from the data. So how does a hospital cope with the COVID-19 pandemic? And I did my case report, and that was nice. And then we looked at the resilience, crisis, and extreme context literature, which gave us a good understanding of sort of what makes COVID-19 special and what is the sort of coping patterns that actors use in order to handle a crisis. This was good. It explained the beginning of what the hospital did, but it didn't explain what happened later on. And what happened later on, we therefore turn to the paradox lens and to what I just told you about either or and both end approaches. And that helped us to first depict sort of an organizing paradox. There's an inherent tension between normal activities the hospital does, like patients who don't have COVID and patients who do have COVID. These are competing demands, especially if you have scarce resources. So that helped us to understand what happened in wave or in the later stages of the pandemic. But that didn't help us to explain why did they run into a staff shortage. And I don't know what's that like in Portugal, but this is all over Switzerland. At the moment, there's hardly any hospital that runs at normal capacity, even though we have very, very few COVID patients hospitalized. So I was looking at that temporal impact, and this is where I got into feedback loops and circular approaches to better understand that. And Langley calls this an outcome irony. When the intended effect, or you intend a certain impact, you try to treat COVID patients and non-COVID patients at the same time, and you end up with less. Why was that so? Because there was an impact on the resources, and it severed and surfaced more tensions, and it had more conflicts. And looking into that, sort of why does that occur? I went back to the paradox literature, and there's this nice article with Sandamasi and Lewis, 2009. They refer to Amazon, and there's an interesting distinction between effective and rational conflicts. And effective conflicts are sort of personal bashing and that sort of stuff, which I observed a lot, and that helped us to explain the occurrence of further tensions that over time risk to undermine the both-and approach. And this is sort of where I get to the current model, which I'm going to try to arrive at in this presentation. So let me jump into the data. This is the COVID-19 pandemic from a Swiss perspective. You see here sort of the timeline and the waves of hospitalized patients from February 2020 to November 21. And if you ask sort of the people, this is sort of how they experienced that. It was like a tsunami coming and you can't run away. For people who treated COVID patients, you turn them for 4 weeks and try everything, and then suddenly in a day they either make it or they die. You see them breathing for their lives, and you think, wow, that could be me. And then sort of in winter 2021, when things were really hard for the hospital, one of the guys said in the meeting, look, we have 3 patient exit paths: the ward, if they get better, the rehab clinic, if they get even better, and the pathology, if they don't make it. And what is interesting about this crisis is it is really different, I think, in quality from what we usually know about extreme or crisis situations, because those are usually regionally limited, where the pandemic was global. They're usually finite in time. It's usually an event, like an earthquake, or so. It can be stretched in time, like a bushfire. But it has a sort of, as being an event, it tends to have, especially an earthquake or a flood, tends to have a more or less stable intensity and speed, and then it's over, and then you start to clean up. With the pandemic, it was different. We didn't, and we still don't know if it ends and when it ends. So it stretches over time. And because everybody is acting and we have a global distribution, we get this dynamic waves of rising and lowering patients and rising and lowering stress for the healthcare system, which we can't predict. Also, actors are both sort of acting on the pandemic, but they're also affected by it because they run the risk of infection. And at least in the Swiss case, these were naive actors. Swiss hospitals didn't know how to handle a pandemic. So it is a sort of uncertain situation which stretches over time and which is volatile. And this, I think, makes COVID-19 special and extreme case. And starting to look at how did the hospital manage this? So here you see again the hospitalizations in Switzerland, the blue curve, and the green curve is the normal activities, and the red curve is the pandemic activities. Normal activities is all what the hospital does in treatment, projects, and so forth without COVID, and the red curve is what they do in COVID. So it starts out with we had a national shutdown, so at the beginning of March. So the government said, so everybody has to shut down their activities in hospitals, and the healthcare system has to switch over to focusing on COVID. This is what they did. And within 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they managed to set up a whole new treatment scheme, testing, diagnosing, isolation, and all that. That was a sort of pretty intense time. I mean, Miguel would call that organized improvisation. I think that would fit very well. And then the first wave was over. The government called off the shutdown, and then they switched back. And what they did over summer in that first wave was that they try to catch up with their normal activities. So they had postponed a lot of treatments, and they try to catch up with that. And according to our interviews, they managed that until the end of the summer. Then came the second wave. And here they try to do something. Exactly, that's first wave. It is a sort of typical switching logic or an either-or approach between normal pandemic activities and normal. And the idea there was that they wanted to avoid the system breakdown. They didn't want to have the situation like northern Italy. We are located fairly close to northern Italy. So what happened in Bergamo really got people on the move. In the second wave, it was a little bit different. There, they said the premise was to continue normal activities as much as possible and simultaneously have the resources available for the COVID patients. And this is what you see sort of here. As the numbers rose in the blue curve, they started to cramp up the red activities, the pandemic activities, and lower down their normal activities. And that sort of worked over for some time until February, and then they started to reverse. They increased the normal activities again, and then they decreased the pandemic activities with a little high in April. But overall, they at that point already had less capacity than before the pandemic. And then came winter 2021 up to 2022, and then the whole thing started all over again. So here we have a sort of more of a both-end approach, normal and pandemic activities in parallel. And I do think that for an enduring disruption makes more sense than the first wave, where the idea was, okay, this is one disruption as an event and it's going to finish. So how did they steer that? How did they steer the red and the green curve? That is sort of the question. And the challenge is here that on the one hand, you have a sort of organizing paradox. You have a tension between pandemic and normal activities. They both support and limit each other. One provides resources for the others. The measures of the pandemic activities help to also secure normal activities, especially if you certain restrictions for infections and so forth. So they are, in a sense, interdependent, but they are also in tension. And this is sort of the goal, what was trying to do both in parallel. And the whole thing, I'm going to show you the solution, but what is behind that is the second paradox, and that's that of decision making. One thing is you don't get out of decision making. And I think a medical doctor really defined it well. He said, in the pandemic, you cannot not decide. Anything you do or you don't do is a decision. In this hospital, it is very important as sort of their culture. We not only need a good quality of decisions, sort of in terms of content, but we also need acceptance, because we're an expert organization, because otherwise nothing much happens. And they moved around dynamically between how much sort of participation in decision making they had and how little they had. Sort of they moved around a little bit here, and they also had some points where they said, look, we are now so much under stress that we don't do that participatory more. We just make more centralized decision making, and then they move back again. Not going to talk about this much today. But they did have a sort of problem with sort of people complying with the decisions. Most of them, you make a decision on reducing normal activities, and most of the clinics complied, but some, of course, didn't. And that was always a source of tension when you try to cope with the pandemic. So I think the tension between pandemic and normal activities, they illustrate an organizing paradox. And that surfaces with resource restrictions, because if you look at the Hippocratic Oath, it doesn't say anything about scarce resources. It says basically treat sick people no matter what. And now you have to make decisions about it. Who are you going to treat? Whom are you going to postpone? And so forth. And also the decentralized decision-making is also an illustration of that organizing paradox. especially in a pluralistic setting like a hospital, because it's sort of always a question between autonomy, differentiation of the different parts, let the clinics do what they do, or do we look at the whole hospital because of our resources? Now, the way they manage that is what we call the calibration mode. So how do you manage these capacities? And that has sort of two sides to that coin. One is a sort of more analytical content dimension, and the other one is a more communicative dimension of who does that and how do they get to those agreements. In terms of the content, the temporal orientation was basically very presence-oriented. They looked at their current numbers, like this slide, this graph here. So it was all the time. They didn't make a prognosis. And then they try to make sense of that. Is that going up? Is that going down? Is it going to stay? They didn't know. At the same time, what they also did, they had sort of escalation levels. They tried to position themselves as a hospital. Okay, where are we now? If we are on level A, then we need little COVID capacities and we can run normal activities fairly straightforward. Do we have to prepare for next escalation of level B? This is here the original data and it's in German, I'm sorry. Then we need to have more on the wards, more on the ICUs, which means reducing more normal activities. And then we have level C, which they differentiated even further to C1 and C2. That would be if really a lot of COVID patients came. So they always try to position themselves vis-a-vis the present temporal situation they were finding themselves in. And this is what happened on the task force level. So we had a large task force with about 36 members, which was more for the acceptance of decisions, and we had a small task force which could meet on a much more on a daily basis, whereas the last large task force met on a weekly basis. But these discussions, they happened on the task force level. This is where they made the general decision, okay, where are we? What does it mean for all of us? But then when you reduce activities, it goes down to the individual patient. You need to know if you postpone Harald, like me with his, I don't know, shoulder problem or not. How did that work? They basically on the clinics in the two major departments in surgery and inner medicine, they set up sort of what I call semi-formal groups. It was usually the head of the ICU, very important clinic heads, and the head of nursing. And here's a quote from the medical department. They met with a cardiologist every day in the morning at 7 to decide how much treatment can we do and how much can't we. And with these short paths that allowed us to ensure that we needed what we needed at the ICU. That's what the head of the ICU says. And they sort of formalized those in the clinic heads meeting. So this group proposed to the clinic heads meeting, okay, we're going to reduce that much, and that approves it then. And of course, since not everybody complied, that required then sort of what they call bilateral meetings, talks in private, where you have to ensure that they reduce, even if they didn't comply with the decision, so you have to back that up. But this is basically their sort of way of calibrating these decisions on the left and really get them into the organization. And that allowed them that created sort of a corridor for action where they could maneuver between normal and pandemic activities. This is how basically the pattern by which they navigated the organizing paradox of pandemic and normal activities. So far we know this. They wanted to do both, as you see above. And the research, the first question was, okay, how do they do that? They do that. The answer is the calibration mode. That helps them to navigate the tension between pandemic and normal activities. But it has a but. And here's some quotes by nursing people and by the hospital CEO. They already realized in the second wave that they were getting short of staff. We had to beg and beg. And we had to scrape up staff together. And that caused numerous discussions. That's a Swiss euphemism for conflicts. So clinics didn't want to give up their staff to work on the COVID wards or on the ICU. People were tired to work there. It's a very, very hard work. And then at the end, in wave 3, they did what the government did in wave 1. They just ordered a 25% reduction because they couldn't handle it anymore. So that was a very, very angry email by the CEO. He said the order is mandatory, which is not often that he says something is mandatory, and then he even puts a sentence in. And if someone asks me what 25% means, it means zero normal activity. So he was pretty pissed off. Sorry for the word. And I talked to him in August, and he said really that learning, that was the brutal learning in COVID for them. He said the staff scarcity, that they really lost the staff. That was the hard part with that approach. So what happened? If we try to analyze this, once we see that on the left-hand side, the capacity of the beds over time goes down. You see that sort of compared to the peak in the first wave on the wards, the upper black line and the lower black line on the ICUs. And you see the dark green curve, which is the sort of number of COVID patients on the wards, and the ICUs, that all went down. The capacity of treatment sort of reduced over time. At the same time, and that I have from the interviews, especially also my recurring interviews, is that they reported more and more tensions. It's like the staff issue has been on since December 2020, and it is still on, and it's getting worse. And if only half of the stories I hear are really true, because I haven't been there, it is pretty hard. They're really going at each other at the moment. And this is a general trend in all hospitals in Switzerland. We see a sort of very, very strong staff shortage. So how does this work? Why does the calibration mode that navigates the organizing paradox can lead to staff shortage? First thing is, doing both raises the resource demand. Because when COVID patients are low, then you're catching up with the normal activities, so it's additional resources. That enhances the workload. And over time, people get exhausted. They call in sick, they quit, and you get staff exit. What happens then is that reduces the resource availability, which then has a negative effect on the workload. For those who remain, it becomes even harder. And you risk a downward spiral here. At the same time, because the resource demands are high, you get into tension rises between availability of resources and the demand. And that raises conflicts between professions, disciplines, which in turn reduces sort of one of the important conditions of the calibration mode, which is collaboration. And the whole thing is even worsened by an overall labor market that is getting drier and drier. So you can't reduce that tension by replacing people. So what we get here is basically two amplifying spirals. One amplifying spiral is on the level of the resources themselves. If we have higher workload that leads to staff exit, then the pressure on the remaining people increases. And if things go bad, those leave them too. And the second amplifying spiral is the one on the decision-making level or on the managing level, is that more and more conflicts reduce the conditions under which this calibration mode works in order to navigate the tensions between pandemic and normal activities. So this is sort of a case-based explanation for why this occurs. Now, if I take a step back, I'm always asked, okay, what is this a case of? And if I look at that for a paradox lens now, one thing we could say, okay, there are, and these are valid interpretations, is we see okay, the system gets under pressure, we see tensions coming up, that surfaces the paradox of professional work, the ongoing sort of status and conflicts between nurses and medical doctors, between administration and medical doctors, and so forth. So we have this paradox of professional work maybe rising up, surfacing medical and economic logics, which have been studied, and they bite each other. And it might be, just severing the tensions of the organizing paradox between the autonomy of the clinics and the overall hospital as a frame of reference. What I'm looking at more from a circular logic is trying to ask myself, okay, why does that lead to an outcome irony or risking a vicious cycle in terms of the impact both end has on reducing staff? And what I found interesting was that distinction between effective and rational conflict. Effective conflicts, as mentioned, are emotional, they're relational, they're personal. So when you watch a TV debate of politicians that go at each other, they're not interested in a rational solution to the problem, they're interested in winning the battle. That is sort of an effective conflict when you get on that level. Rational conflict is more task-oriented. It tries to look for the quality of the argument. If Habermas logic was real, then it would be only that, but it's sort of in that direction. And effective conflicts are known to reduce, and rational conflicts are known to enhance decision quality and implementation. And also, like that, rational conflicts are positive for navigating paradoxes, whereas effective conflicts are the ones that are said to be negative for that. And that helps me to sort of look at this cycle more generally. We have resource scarcity in my case. It's one of the conditions that renders paradoxes salient. That surfaces a paradox, like an organizing one, for which we use a both-and approach to navigate it. Now, what I add here is that this both-and approach impacts maybe on this condition. And it can either sort of, this is what, this would be the good case, if it reduces resource scarcity, for example, then it's sort of, we would get less conflicts or more rational conflicts, and that would strengthen the both-and approach and would enable a virtuous cycle. But as in my case, it triggered effective conflicts, which then undermine the both-and approach. And that is what I think is what enhances or enables vicious cycles. So what we have here is basically idea that the both-and approach not in general leads to a virtuous cycle or enables it, but there's certain conditions. One is sort of it leads to a vicious cycle to the opposite. It has a negative effect when it enhances resource scarcity, like in my case. The calibration mode used more resources, and that affected its handling the tension between pandemic and normal activities. And also it triggered effective conflicts rather than rational ones. So you end up, the more you want to do both, the less you can over time. And that's the outcome irony. So this is what I try to make of this case at the moment. And then how can I take these insights a little bit further? I think it makes sense to look at the relation between responses and cycles, and not only sort of, we are now at the stage that we say we have a paradox, these are the response. But I think it makes sense to go a step further and say, okay, what impact does our response have on the organization and on navigating the paradox? We could further advance the relationship between response approaches, either or in both and the impact in terms of virtuous and virtuous cycles. And if I look at that, I have these approaches like defensive either or ones and both and approaches to paradox. And I have here a distinction between two modes, effective and rational conflicts. And that being a business administrator and living in a flat world of 2 dimensions gives me four fields. And what we know sort of in the literature is that rational contracts and active approaches, they tend to enable virtuous cycles. Much of like that, what Johann Wolfgang von Goethe then said, same leaves us in peace, the contradiction makes us productive, we become creative, and at maximum engage in rational disputes about the best solution. This happens when the feedback on conditions dampens resource scarcity, maybe also plurality and change. We also know about vicious cycles. And these occur especially with either or approaches and when we have effective conflict. And they might be mutually interrelated. The more either or I do, the more effective conflicts I might get, and the more effective conflicts I engage with and remain on my position, the more defensive approaches I get. So that's both pretty stable ones. But I think there's also something like unstable vicious cycles. That's when we have an either or approach, and but the sort of mode of engaging about responses in terms of rational conflicts or rational disputes. And then it really depends on how the situation develops. We can either move towards field one and to the virtuous cycles, or we can move to vicious cycles, depending on how we switch the mode and what the situation is like. So it's either a turn of the tide towards virtuous cycles, or happy people on a sinking boat that move towards the vicious cycle. And I think my case is an example of a fourth one, is a sort of an unstable virtuous cycle. Yes, it's sort of at the beginning, sort of it allowed to do both. It was a live and let live situation with an active approach. At the beginning, they were maybe more rational, but it became more and more effective. And then you start to move into field 4, and from field 4, maybe into field 3 of a vicious cycle. Now, this is just a first initial idea on how we could move forward with the paradox lens to start looking at not only at the paradox and its response, but what kind of effect does the response have. In the future, I think we could look more at the 3 conditions, how our responses impact on the conditions that make paradoxes salient. On resource scarcity, my case is an example, but I also could think about the second condition about change. So more change, maybe more effective conflicts due to confusion. I don't know. Less change, there might be more rational and less conflicts. Plurality is an ambiguous issue. More plurality, maybe more confusion and more effective conflicts, like Abdallah and Langley say. It might be also more enriched and more better decision making. I don't know. And the other way around, there's also double possibility, less plurality, there might be less conflicts and therefore sort of more stable virtuous cycles, but it also risks something like groupthink, and we miss out on the opportunities. So these are pretty open questions. I have no idea about that, but that would be something for future research. So the goal then is I think we need to better understand how we make virtuous circle become sustainable in the future. And that is my only Portuguese words. Muito obrigado. And very much thank you for bearing with me on this research journey. So thank you very much. And I talked too long. Sorry. Thanks.
Thanks again, Harald, for your presence. It was a very interesting approach to your work. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for bearing with me.